She knocked only because there was nowhere else to go. He opened the door not out of kindness, but because silence had become too loud. Miriam didn't come looking for love. Elias didn't believe he deserved a second chance. But out there, beneath snow-laden skies and behind the weathered walls of a lonely cabin, something unexpected grew. Not just warmth, not just trust, a family. Miriam didn't knock because she hoped. She knocked because hope was all that hadn't frozen yet. Her breath, her strength, her faith, they were gone. But not that. She knocked because she had no choice. The wind had chased her for hours across the high valley, slicing through her coat and into the ache of her right leg, the one that never quite healed right after the birth of her last child. Snow packed in her boot soles, then melted, then froze again, stiffening her stride. But she kept walking. For them. Behind her, 3 children followed without complaint. Ruthie, the oldest at 12, gripped her brother's mitten tightly. Samuel, 10 and too thin for this cold, trudged with lowered eyes, carrying his little sister's faded doll tucked under one arm like it might break. And baby Cora, 5, red-cheeked and shivering, clung to Miriam's skirt, her steps clumsy with exhaustion. Miriam hadn't seen a fence line in over an hour. No smoke from a chimney, no worn trail through the trees, nothing. Just snow and more snow, blanketing everything, even her memory of warmth. Then when her legs trembled enough to make her stumble, she saw it. A cabin tucked deep into a slope of pine, square-shouldered and solid against the gray sky. Smoke, a thin, steady stream curling up from the chimney like a flag of possibility. She didn't hesitate, just limped forward, teeth clenched against the pain. Reaching the porch, she knocked once. Then again, a third time, her fist barely audible against the thick wood. She tried to call out, but only a hoarse rasp came. Then the door opened. A man stood in the frame, tall and broad-shouldered, with a coat worn at the seams and a face carved more by silence than age. His beard was trimmed but wild around the chin, and his boots were heavy with snow. He said nothing at first, just looked at Miriam, at the children huddled behind her, at her limp. Then he stepped back. "Come in," he said simply, and she did. The warmth was immediate, not just heat from the fire, though it crackled bright in a stone hearth, but something quieter, steadier. The smell of pine sap and split wood, the hush of a space built by hand and kept by habit. Miriam pushed the children inside first, urging them gently toward the fire. Cora stumbled once, but Ruthie caught her. The man said nothing as he moved to fetch blankets from a wooden chest. He draped one over each child, his movements careful, not slow, not rushed. Miriam stood by the door, still catching her breath. She hadn't planned anything beyond this. Just knock, just hope someone answered. The man looked at her, then at her leg. "You need to sit." "I'm fine," she answered out of reflex. He didn't reply. Just pulled a chair from the table and set it near the fire. She sat. The children huddled close together, their eyes darting from the flames to the stranger, then to her. Cora's lips quivered, and Ruthie rubbed her back in circles the way Miriam once had for them both. Samuel's mitten fell from his hand, forgotten. "What happened?" the man finally asked. Miriam hesitated. "Wagon broke. Days back, we walked." "All the way from town?" She nodded. "From the fork at Bitter Ridge." He whistled low. "That's 15 miles through this storm?" "We didn't have a choice." He didn't question her again. Instead, he set a kettle on the stove, poured water from a bucket beside the door, and went about heating it. He worked quietly, like someone used to doing things without needing to explain himself. "Got food?" he asked. "No," she answered. He nodded. "You'll eat here tonight, then we'll talk. We won't stay long. You'll stay till you're warm, until that leg quits shaking. Then you'll decide." Miriam blinked, realizing she was shaking, not from cold anymore, but from the release of holding herself together too long. "Thank you," she said softly. He didn't reply, but his silence didn't feel cold. The man's name was Elias Thorne. He said it that night, after stew had filled the children's bellies, and Miriam's fingers had stopped aching enough to braid Ruthie's damp hair. "I'm Elias," he said simply. "Built this cabin 5 years back. Haven't had visitors since." Miriam nodded once. "I'm Miriam. These are my children, Ruthie, Samuel, and Cora." He nodded toward the youngest. "She's already asleep. She hasn't slept in 3 nights." He didn't ask why. She didn't offer. But the silence between them was no longer strange. It was a kind of shelter. He let them sleep on pallets near the hearth. Miriam took the hard chair again, insisting it was enough. Elias didn't argue, just added more wood to the fire and set his rifle back near the door. Before he climbed into the loft above, he said just one thing. "No one comes out here. You're safe tonight." Miriam didn't respond aloud, but her hand reached for Ruthie's and the girl squeezed it tight. The days that followed were quiet. The storm passed slowly, but the sky cleared by the third morning. Still, the snow was too deep for travel. Miriam helped where she could, sweeping the porch, boiling water, mending a loose patch on Elias's coat. He didn't stop her, but he watched, not suspiciously, just noting. "You always work like this?" he asked one day. Miriam looked up from the basin. "Like what? Like you're trying to earn your place every hour?" She blinked. "Isn't that what folks do?" Elias didn't answer, just returned to splitting logs. The children settled into a rhythm. Ruthie helped in the kitchen. Samuel asked questions about every tool in the shed. Elias answered with short words and demonstrations. Cora followed the chickens and giggled every time one squawked at her boots. None of them asked when they were leaving, not even Miriam, and that scared her most. One night, Elias set an extra place at the table. "Just soup," he said. "Nothing special." "It's enough," she replied. She meant it. That night, when the children were asleep, she stayed by the fire a while longer. Elias sat in his usual chair, whittling something small and shapeless. "You lost someone?" she asked quietly. He didn't look up. "Yes. Family." He nodded once. "Brother. Years back. Same winter kind of storm. Never found him." "I'm sorry." He paused his carving. "You." She hesitated. "A man who promised to keep us. Walked out when Ruthie got sick. Said he was heading to town for medicine. Never came back." Elias looked at her now. "I'd say I'm sorry, but that'd make it sound like it was something that just happened." She smiled, bitter and soft. "It did happen. The wrong way, but it happened." They didn't speak again that night, but when she stood to check on the children, Elias handed her the whittled shape. It was a bird, not finished, but wings open, mid-flight. "For Cora," he said. Miriam held it close and said nothing. That night she didn't dream of cold. She dreamed of warmth that didn't come from fire, of a cabin that didn't echo empty, of a man whose silence made room for her voice. And for the first time in months, when she woke, she didn't want to leave. The next morning, the sun rose slowly, stretching pale gold fingers across the wide plains beyond Elias's cabin. Miriam stirred before the light fully crested the window, the ache in her leg waking her like clockwork. She sat up on the cot he'd made for her in the corner, tucked just far enough from the hearth to give her privacy, just close enough to feel the warmth. The room smelled faintly of pine, smoke, and something else, something gentle, fresh bread. She blinked and turned toward the kitchen corner, where Elias stood with his back to her, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair still damp from the basin. He was quietly slicing a loaf, steam curling from its center, his movements precise, almost careful, like someone who had spent too long living alone and wasn't used to being watched. "I can help with that," Miriam said, her voice soft but steady. Elias didn't startle. He just glanced over his shoulder and nodded once. "You bake?" "My mother taught me. I was never much good at it, but I remember enough." He stepped aside, offering her the knife and the breadboard without a word. She rose slowly, testing her leg, then crossed the room with that practiced limp. Less a flaw now than a rhythm. They didn't talk much over breakfast. Elias set out a jar of wild honey and poured them each a tin mug of hot water steeped with pine needles. Bracing, bitter, but better than nothing. Miriam watched the way he moved, economical but not rushed. She'd seen men like him before, but never one who wore silence like a second coat, stitched from habit, not pride. After they ate, Elias pulled on his coat and moved to the door. "I'm riding into town," he said. "Supplies. You need anything?" Miriam hesitated. "Do you have paper?" He raised an eyebrow. "And a pencil, if it's not too dear." He gave a short nod, then stepped outside. The sound of hooves faded slow. She stood there alone for a long minute, then slowly sat at the table, hands wrapped around her empty mug. The cabin felt too still without him. By mid-morning, she found herself outside. The frost had melted from the grass, and the sun painted the fields in soft amber. She wandered carefully, the cane Elias had carved for her, tapping lightly against the earth. She didn't go far, just to the edge of the small garden, where weeds had begun to creep through the last rows of kale and onion. She bent slowly, her leg groaning, and began to pull them. It felt good. Honest work, slow work, but hers. She kept at it until her fingers were caked with dirt and sweat beaded beneath her collar. By the time Elias returned, she'd cleared half the patch. He rode in quiet as ever, dismounted without a word. She looked up and smiled, breath clouding in the cool air. "You didn't have to," he said simply. "I know," he paused. "It looks better." Everything looks better in sunlight. Their eyes met for a beat longer than necessary, but neither looked away. That evening after supper, Elias placed a folded paper and a freshly sharpened pencil in front of her on the table. She stared at them for a long time before touching either. "Thank you," she said. He didn't reply, just returned to his chair by the hearth and resumed whittling. Miriam didn't write that night, not right away. Instead, she stared at the blank page as the fire crackled low, trying to find the words she hadn't dared say in years. "Dear Ruth," she wrote finally, her sister's name shaking slightly on the page. She didn't know if the letter would ever find its way. She didn't even know if Ruth still lived in Kansas City or if she would care to hear from the sister who'd left. But writing it felt like exhaling. She folded it neatly, pressed it beneath her palm, and let the silence close in again. Only this time, it felt less heavy. Days began to find their rhythm. Miriam rose early, helped where she could. She swept, cooked, patched a tear in one of Elias's shirts. In return, he let her. Not as charity, not as pity, just as something shared. He began showing her small things, where he kept the flour, how he fed the goats, the way he turned the compost so it wouldn't freeze into a useless lump. He wasn't a talker, but his silences had softened, grown warmer. One afternoon, while she was mending a blanket, he sat across from her and said, "You sew better than the tailor in town." She looked up, surprised. "You've been to a tailor?" "Once, for a funeral. He sewed the sleeves uneven." Miriam laughed, a real laugh, sharp and surprised. Elias blinked, as if startled by the sound, but he smiled faintly too. By the second week, something inside Miriam had shifted. She found herself humming sometimes. She looked forward to the walk to the creek each morning to fetch water. She began saving bits of cloth in a tin for no reason other than they were pretty. One evening, Elias came in later than usual. His boots were caked with mud and his shoulders tense. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded. "Just had a talk with the feed man. Said he heard rumors." She stiffened. "About what?" "Doesn't matter." "It does to me." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "Someone said I had company, a woman, one who walks with a cane, asked if I was hiring house help." Miriam flushed. "And what did you say?" "I said no." He paused. "Said you were staying. That's not help. That's home." The words hit harder than she expected. She couldn't speak for a moment. Her throat was thick. "You said that?" "I did." She rose slowly from the table, crossed to the window, staring out into the dusk. Then she turned. "You know I won't always be useful," she said. "There'll be days I can't walk right. Nights the pain won't let me sleep. I know. I won't give you children. I don't expect any. I can't promise I'll stay forever." Elias stood now too. "You're here now," he said simply. "That's more than I asked." Miriam exhaled and something in her let go. That night she slept not out of exhaustion, but peace. And when the fire burned low and the wind brushed against the shutters like a song, Miriam Lane, who had once been left behind too many times to count, dreamed of staying. Miriam had never seen spring come so slowly. The snow had retreated weeks ago, melting into the thirsty ground and softening the path behind Elias's cabin. But even as the days stretched longer and the birds returned with their morning songs, there was a hesitation in the wind, as if the earth itself held its breath, not yet ready to declare the season change. Still, life inside the cabin had begun to move forward. Each morning Miriam woke before the children, letting the fire revive from its overnight slumber. She would heat a pan of water, knead dough with patient hands, and by the time Elias returned from tending to the animals or walking the fence line, the smell of baking bread welcomed him home. Josie had taken to braiding Miriam's hair in the quiet hours after breakfast. She did so with serious concentration, her small fingers clumsy but gentle, as if each plait was a spell cast to keep them all from being pulled apart again. Henry, ever the quiet one, followed Elias everywhere he could. He'd built a wooden crate from scrap and insisted on collecting kindling each afternoon, dragging it across the yard with as much pride as any ranch hand might muster. Miriam watched them, her children, their routines, and something unfamiliar settled in her chest. It wasn't just relief. It wasn't even safety, though that was new enough. No, it was something sturdier. It was the quiet recognition that maybe, just maybe, they had stopped surviving, that they were beginning to live. Elias never said much, but Miriam had come to understand his silences. There were different types: the thoughtful pause before he answered Josie's endless questions, the cautious hush when Henry slipped and scraped his knee, the full silence that wrapped the cabin in late evening when neither of them needed to speak. One morning, as she stood at the edge of the stream behind the cabin, scrubbing clothes on a stone smoothed by years of running water, Elias joined her with a small bundle under his arm. He knelt without a word, opened the cloth, and showed her a hand-carved washboard, smoother and smaller than the one already leaning against the porch. "Made for your hands," he said simply. Miriam blinked, touched it with reverence. "You didn't have to." Elias only shrugged. "Didn't like seeing you strain on that big thing." They didn't say much else, but when she used the board the next day and felt how easily it fit her rhythm, she understood. He had been watching, not to judge, not to pity, just seeing her. That more than any gift left her throat thick with something that felt suspiciously like longing. One night Josie woke from a bad dream. She didn't scream, didn't cry, just wandered out of bed and into the main room, where the fire still crackled low. Miriam found her standing near the hearth, staring into the embers. She knelt, touched her daughter's shoulder. "Sweetheart, it's late," she whispered. "Come back to bed." Josie looked up, eyes wide and unsure. "Will he leave like Papa did?" The words hit like a stone to the chest. Miriam's breath caught. "No," a quiet voice said from the shadows. Elias. He was seated in the far corner, his book resting closed in his lap. His voice had been gentle but certain. Josie turned toward him, blinking slowly. "Why not?" Elias stood, crossed the space between them with careful steps. He crouched so that his eyes were level with the little girl's. "Because when you find something worth staying for," he said, voice thick, "you stay, even when it's hard, especially then." Josie looked between him and her mother, then nodded once, sleepy, but reassured. When Miriam tucked her back in and returned to the fire, Elias was still there, staring into the glow. She joined him in silence, both of them watching the flames settle low. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. He had spoken a truth both of them had been too careful to name. By late May, Miriam had taken over the garden. Elias had shown her where the old seeds were stored, dusty and half-forgotten, in a tin box beneath the sink. She laid them out by type, sorted what she could save, and began turning over the thawed earth with a vigor she didn't know she still had. Each day the children helped. Josie scattered marigold seeds along the border rows. Henry marked the edges with smooth stones. And in the evenings they'd all walk out as a family, Elias sometimes still wiping sawdust from his hands, and check on the tender shoots pushing up from the soil. The work gave Miriam more than fresh air and calloused palms. It gave her rhythm. Something in her bones softened. aligned. The early grief, still echoing in her dreams, no longer screamed quite so loud. When she lay down at night, it was not with dread, but with earned exhaustion. There was a difference. Then one Sunday morning, while Miriam was kneading the first loaf of bread, Elias entered the cabin holding something behind his back. He stood quietly near the table, shifting slightly, almost awkward. "What is it?" Miriam asked, wiping her hands. He held out a small carved box, no bigger than her palm. The lid slid open smoothly. Inside, nestled in a fold of soft cloth, was a brooch, wooden, hand-carved, the shape of a blooming flower, delicate, exquisite. "It's beautiful," she said, breath-catching. Elias shrugged again, as he always did when caught showing kindness. "Didn't want to wait till your birthday. Figured the day you took this place and made it a home-deserved marking." Miriam stared at the brooch, then at him. No man had ever made her feel like a moment in her life mattered. Not like this. She pinned it to her collar with shaking fingers, and when she looked up again, Elias had turned away, busying himself with the fire, but his ears were flushed pink. That night when the children were asleep and the moon was high, Miriam stepped onto the porch where Elias sat sharpening a chisel. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside him, the night quiet around them. Then slowly she said, "You gave us more than shelter." Elias looked up, waiting. "You gave us place, dignity, a chance to breathe." He studied her. "You gave it to yourself. I just cleared space." She stepped closer. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid I'd never be more than the woman left behind. Afraid I'd forgotten how to live. But now, I laugh. My children laugh." She sat beside him. "It feels like a miracle." Elias set the chisel down, his hands stilling. "It's not a miracle, Miriam." He looked at her directly. "It's what happens when someone stops running long enough to be seen." The air between them shifted, and for the first time Miriam reached for his hand. He didn't flinch. The late spring sun filtered gently through the pine trees as Miriam stood at the edge of the clearing, her arms folded and eyes searching the tree line. She wasn't waiting for anything in particular. Elias had taken Ben out early to check the traps, and the twins were inside arguing over who got the larger slice of cornbread. But she found herself watching the woods anyway. It was a habit she had developed over the last month, waiting without realizing she was. Listening for a world she no longer feared, but hadn't quite learned to trust. She had begun to measure time not by days, but by quiet rituals. The way Elias brewed coffee before sunrise, the shuffle of Ben's feet as he ran down the hallway in the morning, the soft hum of the twins reciting their lessons over the kitchen table. It was in these repetitions that Miriam began to feel something unfamiliar. Safety, yes, but also permanence. Elias and Ben returned before noon, both dusted with pollen and pine sap. Ben carried a bundle of wild mint, grinning from ear to ear. Elias gave her that slow, quiet nod he always did, but this time there was a glint in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Something close to joy. "We didn't catch much," Elias said, setting a light pack down by the porch. "But the creek's running high. The fish will be biting soon." Ben bounded up the steps and dropped the mint into Miriam's waiting hands. "I picked it myself. Elias said it helps with bellyaches." Miriam smiled, brushing a leaf between her fingers. "It does, and it smells like summer. Good work, sweetheart." She looked up at Elias. "Thank you." He shrugged, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. He asked if he could help. I let him. It was always like that with Elias. Simple words, bigger meanings tucked beneath. Later, after supper and story time, when the children were asleep and the house had settled into its nighttime hush, Miriam stood on the back porch, staring up at the stars. Elias joined her, wordless at first, arms folded as he leaned against the post. "It feels like we belong here," she said finally, her voice barely more than a breath. "Not just passing through, not surviving, belonging." Elias didn't speak, but she could feel the way he looked at her, the intensity in it, the quiet agreement. "I was thinking," he said eventually, "we could build them a swing, by the tree near the creek. It gets good shade." Miriam turned, her heart catching a little. "They'd like that." He nodded. "I know. And maybe Maybe a second coop for chickens. If we want more eggs. She stepped closer. If, Elias exhaled slowly, his voice gentling. If this is it, if you want to stay, I'd like to plan for more than just one season. She didn't answer right away, just slid her hand into his. That was answer enough. The next day, they began building the swing. Elias marked the trees while Miriam measured rope lengths. The children watched eagerly from a safe distance until Elias invited them closer, showing Nathan how to hold a saw properly and guiding Sarah's hands on the sanding block. Miriam stood back for a moment, watching them all together. Elias kneeling beside Ben, holding a knot steady. The twins perched on the fallen log, handing tools back and forth. Her eyes stung unexpectedly. This wasn't just repair. It wasn't survival. It was building. They hung the swing 2 days later, the wood polished and smooth, the ropes thick and secure. Miriam pushed the twins first, laughing as they squealed with delight. Ben soon begged for a turn, his legs kicking wildly as he swung high over the creek, his giggles echoing through the trees. Elias stood beside her, arms crossed, a smile hidden in his beard. "You did good," she said, bumping his shoulder lightly. "We did good," he replied. That night, the children fell asleep faster than ever. Miriam walked through the quiet house, pausing at each door. Nathan was curled up with a book still in hand. Sarah and Ruth were asleep holding hands. Ben had rolled out of his blanket entirely and was snoring softly on his stomach. She stepped into the living room where Elias was lighting the last of the lamps. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then he spoke. "I never planned for any of this," he admitted. "Not after." "I know," she said. "Me neither." He stepped closer. "But I want to. If you do." Miriam's voice trembled. "I do." He touched her cheek, reverent and slow, like the first time he touched her hand after that long walk through the storm. "Then we start planning," he said. "For all of it." She leaned into his touch. Together. Outside, the night was calm. The trees whispered only gently. And for the first time in years, Miriam dreamed not of escape or fear, but of home. And it was enough. Miriam woke to birdsong and the scent of pine smoke drifting faintly through the cabin. The sunlight filtered in at just the right angle to light the patchwork quilt that lay across her chest, stitched from old shirts and soft scraps of flour sacks. For a moment, she just listened. The low creak of wood beneath shifting weight, the muffled rustle of bed sheets from the children's room, and beneath it all, the low hum of the morning beginning. She rose quietly, tying her shawl around her shoulders and padding barefoot across the cool floor. In the kitchen, Elias stood by the stove, already preparing a pot of oats. He glanced up as she entered, and though his smile was small, it was warm and easy, familiar. "Morning," he said simply. "Morning," she echoed, reaching for 2 mugs. She poured the coffee he'd brewed, handed him one, and leaned against the counter beside him. "Nathan's already outside," Elias said. "Chopping wood." Miriam raised an eyebrow. "That boy never stops." Elias chuckled. "He asked for gloves, said he wants calluses like mine." Miriam smiled softly and shook her head. Sarah was humming in her sleep, some song her mother used to sing, and Ruth mumbled something about pie. "I think your apple pie ruined her standards." Elias shrugged. "We all need something sweet." They shared a quiet breakfast, the kind where the silence isn't heavy, but restful. Then one by one, the children drifted into the kitchen. Nathan with his cheeks red from the wind, Sarah and Ruth trailing each other in mismatched socks, and Ben, sleepy-eyed and yawning, wrapped in a blanket like a burrito. They ate together, laughing at Ben's bedhead and teasing Nathan about the uneven logs he'd stacked. Elias passed out the chore list they'd scribbled on an old flour sack. Miriam helped Ruth and Sarah clean the windows, while Nathan and Elias went to repair the fence behind the henhouse. Miriam sees Ben drawing on a scrap of paper. It's a picture of their house. In crayon, he wrote "home" above it. She folds the picture and keeps it in her apron pocket, her eyes wet. Miriam found herself humming as she worked, wiping down the front door with a rhythm she hadn't even noticed she'd kept from her childhood. Later, they gathered by the creek for lunch, cold biscuits, slices of cheese, and wild strawberries the children had picked that morning. Elias lay back in the grass, arms folded beneath his head, and let the sunlight wash over him. Miriam sat with her back against a tree, her eyes tracing the curve of his jaw, the peace in his features. "We should build a bench here," she said, half to herself. Elias opened one eye. "A bench?" She nodded. "Right under this tree, so we can sit in the shade and watch them grow up." He didn't answer at first, just looked at her for a long, quiet second. Then he sat up slowly and said, "Then we better make it strong. Something that'll last." That evening, while the children played a game with sticks and stones by the garden, Elias fetched a plank of pine and two thick branches. With Nathan's help, he sanded and shaped the wood until it was smooth. Miriam brought nails and a hammer. They worked together until twilight, and by the time the stars blinked into view, the bench stood proud and sturdy beneath the old tree. Miriam sat on it first, testing its strength. Elias sat beside her, and in the hush of evening, as crickets began their low symphony and the children chased fireflies barefoot across the grass, he reached for her hand. "I used to think I'd die in silence," he said. "Not sad, just quiet. No noise. No one missing me." Miriam squeezed his fingers gently. "Me too." He turned toward her. "But then you knocked, and now there's laughter, burnt biscuits, muddy footprints, bedtime stories. Now there's this bench." Together they built a small wooden sign. Miriam painted the words slowly, her hand trembling just a little. "Still Water Home." They planted it beside the garden. It wasn't just a name, it was a promise. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Now there's us." And in that moment, under the soft shimmer of stars and the creak of pine trees in the wind, it felt like all the pieces they'd each lost along the way had finally found a place to rest. The next morning brought a soft drizzle, gentle enough to keep them indoors, but steady enough to make the whole world smell like earth and green things growing. The children dragged their blankets into the main room and made a fort under the table, giggling as they passed secret messages written on napkins. Miriam baked biscuits, the good kind with buttermilk, and Elias whittled a small sparrow from a piece of cherry wood. When he was done, he handed it to Ruth, who squealed with delight. Later, they all gathered by the hearth, wrapped in quilts and trading stories. Miriam told them about her grandmother's farm, how the wind would whistle through the rafters like a song, and Elias spoke about the time he'd gotten lost in the woods at 12 and had to follow a raccoon back to camp. Ben fell asleep first, curled on Elias's lap. Sarah and Ruth dozed off together. Nathan stayed up longest, head resting against Miriam's shoulder. Before he closed his eyes, he whispered, "I'm glad he let us in." Miriam kissed the top of his head. "Me too." And somewhere in the quiet, while the rain tapped gently against the window panes, Miriam realized they hadn't just found shelter, they had found home. The rain cleared overnight, leaving the earth damp and glistening under a low curtain of mist. The air smelled of cedar and soft mud, and the birds, grateful for the break in the weather, sang louder than they had in days. Miriam stepped onto the porch in her bare feet, a mug of coffee warming her hands, and let the morning wrap itself around her like a blanket. Inside the cabin, the children still slept, bundled under patchwork quilts. Even Nathan, who usually rose before the sun, had surrendered to the deep peace of the storm's passing. Only Elias was awake, sitting at the edge of the porch sharpening one of the kitchen knives with steady, deliberate movements. He glanced up as Miriam approached. "They sleep deep after rain. They feel safe," she said quietly, settling beside him. "That's new." Elias paused in his work and looked out over the clearing. "Feels new for me, too." For a long time they didn't speak. The silence wasn't awkward. It never was with Elias. It simply allowed space, for breath, for thought, for something deeper to take root. "I keep thinking this can't last," Miriam admitted, her voice low. "That I'll wake up and the ground will shift again." Elias set the blade aside. "Life's always shifting, Miriam, but that doesn't mean it has to take everything with it." She turned to him. "I've been running since Jacob died, then from my own folks, then from that man who thought he could trade safety for silence. I kept thinking if I could just find the right place, everything would fix itself." Elias's eyes softened. "It's not the place, it's the people who stay." She looked down at her coffee. "Well, I'm tired of running, and I'm tired of waiting for something to go wrong. I want to choose something. I want to build something." He reached out and took her hand in his. Then let's build it. Later that morning, the children tumbled out of bed, wild-haired and hungry. Miriam made cornbread and eggs, and Elias took them to the garden plot afterward. They planted beans and onions, Sarah insisting on naming each row. Ruth helped Elias spread compost, her small hands filthy but her smile bright. Ben toddled around chasing a chicken that didn't seem too bothered by the attention. Nathan asked to help with the well, and Elias showed him how to test the rope, how to seal the bucket so it didn't leak. For a boy who had seen too much too soon, he looked at Elias like he was something close to solid ground. In the afternoon, Miriam sewed by the window while the younger ones napped. The soft sound of Elias hammering outside came through the open shutters. He was mending the barn roof, and she caught herself smiling when he paused to take off his hat and rake a hand through his hair, streaked now with a little more silver than she remembered from the first day. That evening, the cabin was lit with laughter. Elias brought in wildflowers from the field, clumsily arranged in a mason jar. "For the table," he said with a shrug. Miriam placed them at the center like fine china. Ben offered her a rock he claimed was magic. Sarah presented a lopsided braid of grass she called a crown. Ruth recited a story she made up, and everyone clapped like it was Shakespeare. Nathan grinned so wide his ears turned red. After supper, they sat on the porch, Miriam in her rocking chair, Ruth on her lap. Elias carved a new figurine, this one a fox for Sarah. Nathan leaned against the railing, recounting how he and Elias had startled a deer near the creek. "It just looked at us," he said, eyes wide, "like it wasn't afraid, like it knew we didn't mean harm." "Maybe it did," Elias said softly. Night came, as it always did, but this time it brought no fear. Miriam tucked the children in. Ben clung to her shirt. "Promise we stay?" he asked. She kissed his forehead. "We stay." Then she joined Elias by the fire. They sat without words until he said, "You once asked if this could be home." "Still wonder that." She shook her head. "I know it now." He reached for her hand again. "You're the heart of this place." She smiled. "You're the walls." He leaned in, and when they kissed, it wasn't rushed. It was full. Full of all the days behind them, and all the days they would now dare to plan. Because this wasn't just surviving. This wasn't just a shelter. This was a life, built slowly, held together by laughter, patience, and the quiet courage of choosing each other. And for the first time in their lives, they weren't just surviving. They were rooted, named, home. Some stories don't begin with falling in love. They begin with survival, with loss, with a quiet knock at the door, and a decision to stay. Miriam and Elias didn't rescue each other. They built something together, piece by piece, choice by choice. And sometimes that's what real family is. Have you ever found something beautiful where you least expected it? A place, a person, a moment that gave you hope again? Share your story in the comments. We read everyone. Because around here, your voice matters just as much as theirs. The knock was barely more than a whisper against the gate. But in the high country, nothing knocked after dark unless it meant trouble or a miracle. When Delaney Quinn opened her door, she found a man bleeding out with a newborn baby in his arms. She had no reason to help him, but sometimes the West doesn't wait for reasons. It waits for choices, and that choice would change everything. The man hit the ground with a sound that wasn't quite a fall and not quite a surrender. More like the way a tree gives into time, leaning until the roots finally let go. Delaney Quinn didn't scream. She crouched beside him, heart pounding like a war drum in her ears, and reached for the child first. The baby girl, barely a month old if that, was flushed with heat, her skin dry and her lips pale. Delaney pressed her palm to the girl's forehead and felt the telltale warmth of a fever. Then she looked to the man. He wasn't old, mid-30s maybe, sun-seared skin, a week's-old beard, eyes closed tight in pain or exhaustion, or both. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, soaked in blood. Not fresh, not fatal, but bad. His boots were cracked, barely stitched together. His hands, split at the knuckles like he'd fought through something or someone just to get here. "Damn it," she muttered, hauling herself up. "Why me?" She carried the baby inside first, laid her in an old feed basket lined with quilts, then returned to drag the man in by the arms. He was heavier than he looked, all dead weight and dried mud, but she managed. Once inside, she settled him near the hearth, stripped away the bloodied shirt, and poured whiskey over the wound. He didn't wake, not even when she stitched him up with her father's old medical kit and cursed under her breath the whole time. The baby cried only once that night, softly like she knew too much already. Delaney fed her from a bottle she hadn't used in years, warmed on the stove, and rocked her in silence until the crying stopped. She didn't name the girl in her mind, but she did hum to her, a tune her mother used to sing, one about rivers and stars. By dawn, the man was breathing steady, though still unconscious. The child slept tucked beneath a quilt made from Delaney's mother's dresses. The land outside was still. Nothing moved but the shadows. The snow line on the northern ridge hadn't melted yet, and the cold hung to the porch rail like breath held too long. Then came the hooves. Delaney spotted the dust trail before she heard the knock. 3 riders. The one in front wore a silver badge. Sheriff Merrick. The man had a reputation, not for justice, but for remembering favors and debts. She opened the door slowly, arms crossed, her face blank. "Morning, Delaney," Merrick said, tipping his hat. "We're looking for a man. Might have come through here late last night. Name's Elias Roan. Got a warrant on him. You seen anyone?" Delaney didn't blink. "No one's come by, just me and the chickens." "You sure?" The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Word is he's traveling with an infant. That sound familiar?" She stepped forward slightly, blocking the view into the house. "Ain't seen a soul, but if I do, I'll be sure to send word." Merrick didn't move. Neither did his deputies. One of them, younger, glanced past her shoulder, but all he saw was the dim glow of the hearth and a rocking chair. The cradle had been moved just out of sight. Delaney's boots hadn't even tracked blood. She'd scrubbed the boards clean at dawn. Finally, Merrick nodded. "All right, just figured I'd ask." They turned and rode off, the horses kicking up grit in their wake. Delaney watched them until they disappeared into the trees. Only then did she shut the door and lock the latch. She leaned back against the wood and exhaled, a long, slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Inside, the man stirred. His voice cracked, dry and hoarse. "Where is she?" Delaney turned. "She's fine, sleeping." His eyes, dark, alert, focused on her like he was trying to figure out whether he was still alive. Who are you?" "Delaney Quinn. This is my land. You nearly died on it." He tried to sit up and failed. "The baby, she's all right, but you're not. You've got a fever and a bullet graze. I stitched you best I could. Now tell me who you are and why the sheriff's asking about a man named Elias Roan." He flinched at the name. Even in his weakened state, it was a reflex. "I'm Elias," he said slowly. "Roan, and I'm not a criminal." "No one said you were," Delaney replied evenly, though her hand still hovered near the rifle by the door. "But you're gonna have to do better than that if you expect to stay." He looked toward the cradle near the fire. The baby shifted in her sleep, her tiny fist curled beneath her chin. His eyes softened. "Her name's Maisie," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "She's all I have left." Delaney didn't respond, not right away. Instead, she poured him a cup of water, helped him drink, and sat back down near the hearth. "You're lucky I'm not the sort to hand strangers over just because some badge knocks," she said. "But I don't make a habit of taking in runaways either. So, what's your story?" He looked into the fire, and his silence was the loudest thing in the room. Finally, he said, "The story's long, and I don't have much voice left to tell it." "You'll find it soon enough," Delaney said, rising. "And when you do, I'll be waiting to hear it." Elias didn't argue. He just nodded once. Then he closed his eyes again and drifted into the kind of sleep only desperation allows. That night, Delaney lay awake in her loft, listening to the baby's soft breathing and the crackle of the fire. She didn't know why she'd lied, why she'd taken them in. Maybe it was the way Elias had held the baby even unconscious. Maybe it was the letter she'd found tucked into the inside of his coat pocket, a short, desperate scrawl written to someone named Cora. "I couldn't let them take her. Not for a name, not for money. She's not their burden. She's mine." Delaney folded the letter and set it aside. She understood what it meant to carry something alone. She had done it every day since her father died and the world forgot her name. And now, against every better judgment she'd ever held, she had let someone in. Elias didn't speak much the next day. He moved slowly, still weak, but upright. Delaney gave him space. He didn't ask for help, and she didn't offer it unless it was necessary. That suited her fine. The baby, Maisie, was quieter than most infants Delaney had seen. She hardly fussed, just watched, wide-eyed, with the kind of gaze that seemed to carry memory, like she'd already learned that silence was the safest choice. By the third morning, Elias insisted on helping. He insisted harder than he probably should have, given the way he winced every time he lifted his arm. But Delaney let him. Sometimes letting a man do a thing was more merciful than stopping him. He carried wood, slow and stiff, mucked the goat pen without complaint. When she passed him a bucket of feed for the chickens, he took it without a word and walked across the yard like he'd done it all before. And maybe he had. Delaney watched him from the porch, arms folded, eyes scanning his posture. There was something in the way he moved, like a man used to labor, sure, but also one used to glancing over his shoulder. That night, when Maisie started to cry, Elias was the first to reach her. He rocked her gently, humming a low tune Delaney didn't recognize. Something that sounded like a river would if it could sing. The baby settled quick. Delaney stood by the stove pretending not to watch. She poured hot water over dried herbs and let them steep, the scent of mint and willow bark rising. She didn't speak until he laid the baby back in her cradle. "You handle her well," she said. Elias looked up, his face half shadowed by firelight. "She's all I've got." Delaney didn't respond right away. She handed him the tea and took her seat again. "You mentioned someone named Cora," she said after a moment. "That letter I found." His fingers tightened around the mug, but he didn't flinch. "She was Maisie's mother," he said. "We weren't married, not on paper. Her family wouldn't have allowed it. They were R. Langfords. Maybe you've heard the name?" Delaney nodded slowly. "Cattle barons, big landowners out east. Control most of the rail routes heading into New Mexico." "Yeah," Elias muttered. "That's them." She waited. When he didn't continue, she pressed softly. "And they're looking for you." "Not me," he said. "The child. They didn't want her before. Now she's proof of scandal, of inheritance. They can't have that." Delaney let the weight of that settle in the room. The fire crackled. Wind brushed the windows. Somewhere outside, a coyote howled, distant and lonely. "So they sent men," she said. He nodded. "To find me, to take her. Maybe not kill me, but I don't think they'd mind if I didn't make it back." Delaney's jaw clenched. "And Sheriff Merrick?" "Bought," Elias said. "Or at least rented." She didn't ask for evidence. She knew Merrick. She knew what kind of lawman smiled too easily and remembered too much. Delaney stood and walked over to the mantel. She picked up a small bundle that had been lying untouched on the shelf. Elias's saddlebag. She held it out to him. "You should go through this. If there's anything they're tracking, it might be in there." Elias took the bag reluctantly. He sat down on the floor near the fire and opened it with careful fingers. Inside, beneath worn clothes and a broken compass, was a folded piece of paper, torn at the edge, ink smudged. Delaney watched as his face changed. He unfolded it slowly, as if the act might split him in half. "What is it?" she asked gently. "It's from Cora," he said. "She must have tucked it in before I left. I never saw it." He read it aloud, his voice thick. "Elias, if you find this, it means I didn't make it. Please don't let them take her. Don't let her grow up in that house. She's more you than me. That's a good thing. If you love her, run. Don't stop. They'll never let her just be a child. They'll turn her into leverage, into legacy. Promise me, don't let them." His voice broke on the last word. Delaney turned away, giving him space, but her fists were clenched at her sides. She'd never had a child, never planned to. The land was too rough, the world too sharp. But hearing those words, seeing the way Elias cradled that baby like she was the last light left in a long tunnel, it stirred something. "She wrote that before she died?" Delaney asked quietly. "She went into labor too early," he replied. "We were already on the road. I tried to get her help, but it was just me, a blanket, a storm, and the sound of her whispering Maisie's name with every breath." Delaney closed her eyes. She didn't want to imagine it, but part of her already had. "You didn't bring war to my door, Elias," she said. "It was already coming. You just gave it a face." He looked up at her. "You could still turn us in. They'd pay you." She stepped forward, bent down, and lifted Maisie into her arms. "I've lived alone a long time," she said. "Enough to know what I'll stand for, what I won't." He watched her closely. "And?" he asked. Delaney looked down at the child nestled in her arms, then back at him. "I won't let men with titles and money take a child who's never hurt anyone." She paused. "But we need to be smart. If they sent Merrick, there'll be more." Elias nodded, slowly rising to his feet. "Then we prepare." And just like that, a decision was made. Not with shouting or blood or drawn guns, but in a quiet room with a sleeping baby and two people too tired to pretend anymore. Outside, the wind shifted. The air smelled of sage and dry earth. Somewhere miles away, a rider dipped into a canyon with orders to follow. But here, in a small house lit by firelight and grit, lines had been drawn. Delaney Quinn had taken in a man and his daughter, and now she would stand between them and the world. The frost had just begun to let go of the earth when Delaney found the letter. It was tucked inside the saddlebag Elias had set down by the doorway, half buried beneath a ragged shirt in a cracked wooden rattle. She hadn't been looking to snoop. She was gathering kindling near the door and nearly tripped over it. When the shirt fell away, the edge of the envelope poked out. Wax seal half broken, the parchment worn soft with age. She hesitated, then picked it up. It wasn't addressed to Elias. It was from him. She knew she shouldn't read it, but she also knew the man wasn't telling her everything. And if they were going to face down whatever was coming, secrets could kill just as easily as bullets. So she read it. "To whomever ends up reading this, I was never good at staying still, never good at silence. But I knew how to run, and I knew how to hold a baby without dropping her, even when the world was falling apart. That's something, I guess. If you're reading this, it means I'm probably dead, or close, or too tired to explain it all again. So here's the truth. I didn't steal Maisie. I didn't kill Cora. I didn't ruin a family name for spite or revenge. I just couldn't let her become currency. The Langfords wanted to sell her off. Bloodline be damned. Said a child born out of wedlock was better raised elsewhere. Quietly, far away. She wasn't even a person to him. Just a liability. I ran. Not because I'm a coward, because she was worth running for." Delaney folded the letter carefully and slid it into her apron pocket. Then she walked out to the corral, where Elias was hauling water in a sloshing bucket, shirt clinging to his back with sweat despite the cold. "You wrote to someone," she said. He turned, surprised by the bluntness in her voice. "I've written to a lot of people. This one felt final." He set the bucket down and wiped his hands on his trousers. "You read it?" "I did." He didn't flinch, didn't accuse her of trespass or privacy, just nodded slowly once. "I figured if I died out there, someone should know why." Delaney leaned against the fence. "You didn't steal her." "No," he said, "I saved her." Silence stretched between them like taut rope. "I'm not here to drag out confessions," she said, "but if men come riding to my door, I need to know what they think you did." Elias dropped his gaze. "They think I took something that doesn't belong to me. But that baby, she's not theirs. She never was. Do they have legal papers? Custody orders? They've got influence. That's heavier than paper around here." Delaney understood that too well. In these parts, men with power didn't need laws. They had names. They had men with guns. They had favors. "You know what they'll do to get her back?" she asked. "Whatever they have to." Delaney nodded. "Then we make it not worth the price." That night she made a list. It wasn't a long one, just 3 things. 1. Reinforce the root cellar. 2. Block the western trail with felled logs. 3. Find out who else knew Elias was here. She started with the root cellar. It had once been a storm shelter. Her father had dug it during a particularly cruel tornado season, reinforcing the walls with stone and timber. Delaney hadn't used it in years, but now she swept out the dust, scrubbed the floor, and set up a cradle in the far corner. Maisie would be safest there if things turned. Next came the trail. Elias handled that part. He took the hatchet and disappeared into the pines. Delaney heard the cracks and thuds from the porch, saw the sap bleeding down the bark. By sunset, they'd blocked off the narrowest ridge path with 4 thick logs. It wouldn't stop riders, but it would slow them. That left the third item. The morning after, Delaney rode into town. Dry Creek was little more than a cluster of shops and half-occupied houses. A saloon, a feed store, a church that doubled as a meeting hall on Sundays. The air smelled like sawdust and old beans. People nodded to her as she passed, but not warmly. Just enough to say, "We know you, but you're not one of us." She tied her horse outside the general store and stepped inside. The bell jingled overhead, and an older woman looked up from behind the counter. Esther Hart, widow, sharp as a hawk and twice as watchful. "Morning, Delaney," she said. "Haven't seen you since last frost." Delaney nodded. "Needed flour, lamp oil, and some news." Esther raised an eyebrow. "What kind of news?" "Riders, outsiders. Anyone asking about a man traveling with a child?" Esther hesitated, then leaned forward. 2 days ago, a man in a gray duster came through. Didn't say much. Paid with coins stamped out of Georgia. Asked if we'd seen a drifter named Elias. Had a flyer. Did he leave it? Number took it with him. Said he was coming back." Delaney's stomach tightened. "Was he alone?" Number had 2 others, quiet types. One carried a whip on his belt, not the cattle kind. That told her all she needed. Delaney bought her flour and oil, thanked Esther, and rode home at a gallop. When she got back, Elias was in the barn feeding the goats. He didn't ask, just saw her face and nodded. "They found us." "Not yet," she corrected, "but they will." Maisie was asleep inside, cradled in the curve of a rocking chair. Delaney picked her up, held her close, and looked at Elias. "They're not after you, Elias. Not really. They're after her. You just happen to be standing in the way." "Then I'll keep standing." Delaney looked down at the baby. She was soft, warm, smelled like straw and milk, completely unaware of the fire gathering around her tiny body. "She's worth it," Delaney whispered. Elias didn't answer with words. He just reached out, gently brushed his fingers over Maisie's hair, and met Delaney's eyes with something steadier than fear. Conviction. That night, after the baby was tucked away, after the goats were fed and the fire banked low, Delaney sat at the table and pulled the letter from her pocket, the one Elias had written. She didn't burn it. She folded it tight, slid it into a jar, and buried it beneath the floorboards of the kitchen. Just in case. Because if the worst came, if the house fell, the land was taken, and the names erased. She wanted someone to know that once, a man ran not for himself, but for a child, and that someone stood with him. They came at sundown, not with torches, not with shouting. They came quiet. 3 riders dressed in dust-colored coats, faces hidden beneath wide brims and shadows. Their horses were well fed, their saddles polished, but none of them wore badges. And that, to Delaney, was louder than gunfire. Men without badges didn't knock. They circled once around the edge of her land, not crossing the fence line. Not yet. Just watching, measuring. Delaney stood at the edge of the porch, rifle resting in the crook of her elbow. Not raised, not lowered, just visible. Elias stepped up beside her, eyes narrowed. "Langford men," he said. "You sure?" "I know the way they ride. Calm, like they've already won." Delaney didn't answer. She didn't need to. She'd seen war before, in quieter forms, in the eyes of lone collectors, in the soft-spoken threats of town councilmen. These men were the next storm rolling in, polished, paid, and unafraid. When they turned back toward the ridge without a word, she exhaled. But it wasn't relief. It was timing. They weren't here to kill yet. They were here to plan. That night, Elias slept with his rifle beside him. Delaney barred every door, shuttered every window, and tucked Maisie in the root cellar again. She didn't cry, not even once, as if the girl already knew what it meant to hide. Delaney sat by the stove until the fire burned low. Her father's old map spread across the table. She marked the southern ridge, the weak fencing by the goat pens, the window view angles. Every line mattered now. She circled the porch in her mind. How long it took to cross, how far her voice would carry, how many rounds she had left. Then quietly she pulled a second sheet of paper from the drawer. A letter. Not to be sent. Not right away. Just in case. If they come for us. The baby's name is Maisie Quinn. She's not blood of mine, but she's mine all the same. Her mother died bringing her into this world. Her father's the only man I've ever known who ran not to save himself, but to save someone else. We fought back. We didn't run. This land is ours, not by deed, but by blood and sweat and choice. If someone finds this letter, it means we didn't survive, but it also means we stood for something when we had the chance. She folded it once, slid it into the tin alongside Elias's old confession, and sealed the floorboard again. Outside, the coyotes howled. The next morning, there was a letter. Not mailed, not delivered. Posted. A knife pinned it to the fence post just beyond the corral, right where the sun hit the wooden grain at dawn. Delaney saw it from the porch and didn't hesitate. She walked straight to it, tugged the knife free, and read it in full view of the open field. You have something that doesn't belong to you. You have until the full moon to return it. If you choose to ignore this offer, we will reclaim what is ours by force. No badge, no trial, just consequence. There was no signature, just a red wax mark at the bottom, a tree split by lightning. She walked back to the house, letter in hand. Elias looked up from where he was rocking Maisie on the porch. They've given us a deadline, she said. How long? 3 days. He didn't speak for a while. Then, they're trying to scare us, make us flinch. Delaney shook her head. They're not bluffing. Elias rose, took the paper from her hand, and read it again. This mark, he said, tapping the wax. It's from the Langford's private security. Not legal, just loyal. Trained men, mercenaries, some of them. So they won't stop. Not unless we make them. Delaney nodded once. Then we do. That day they worked faster than before. Delaney climbed into the loft and pulled out her father's old rifle. Longer barrel, better sightline. Elias dug out the traps and re-oiled the hinges. Every door got reinforced. The windows, cross-barred. The chickens were moved inside the barn. The goats driven to the north slope with enough feed to last a week. The land wasn't a home anymore. It was a line in the sand. Late that night, Delaney found Elias outside by the gate, sitting with his back against a fence post, staring up at the moon. You should sleep, she said. I will, he replied. Soon. She sat beside him, knees pulled to her chest, rifle resting across her thighs. Tell me something true, she said after a while. He glanced at her. Like what? Something no one else knows. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, when I buried Cora, I didn't say goodbye. I couldn't. I thought if I said it, it would make her death real. So I just left. Delaney didn't look at him, just kept her eyes on the horizon. Sometimes, he continued, I still dream that she's alive, that she's in some other place, raising Maisie without me. And in the dream, Delaney asked. She forgives me, he said, his voice breaking. Delaney reached over and laid a hand on his knee. She would have forgiven you in real life too. He didn't answer, but he didn't pull away. The next day passed in stillness. Too still. The kind of quiet that made the hairs on Delaney's arms rise. The sky hung heavy. No birds, no wind. Just the creak of wood and the breath of a baby in a cradle beneath the earth. She checked the traps, loaded the rifle, reviewed every inch of the perimeter. Nothing moved. Then at dusk, the first sound. Hooves. 4, maybe 5. She stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. 5 riders came into view, not galloping, just arriving. As if this were business, and for them it was. The lead rider stopped just outside the fence line. He didn't speak. He just reached into his coat, pulled out a folded paper, and tossed it onto the ground. Then he turned and rode off without another word. Delaney didn't move until they disappeared over the ridge. Then she picked it up. It was blank. Just one sentence, scrawled in the middle. You made your choice. She crumpled it in her hand and looked toward the barn where Elias stood. Maisie bundled against his chest. We hold, she said. He nodded, and the land fell silent again. waiting, breathing, bracing for the war to come. They came before dawn, not with fire this time, with silence. Delaney sensed them before she saw them. A shift in the wind, a pressure in the chest, the kind of quiet that only arrives when men are hiding in it. She was already awake when the first branch cracked. In the root cellar, Maisie slept curled in the crook of a quilt, safe beneath two locks and a prayer. Elias was by the barn, crouched in the shadows, shotgun across his lap, eyes narrowed toward the eastern trail. Delaney waited just inside the front door, her father's long rifle resting against her shoulder, fingers steady on the trigger guard. Her boots didn't creak on the floorboards. She'd removed the center planks herself and filled the gaps with sand. No sound. They'd practiced for this, drilled every blind spot, marked every fallback. The plan wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and it was enough. The first shot didn't come from them. It cracked from the south fence. A warning. They didn't flinch. Delaney ducked low and peered through the east-facing window, catching a glimpse of movement. A man in a long gray coat, slipping between the trees, rifle low, steps soft. One of the Langford mercs. Elias spotted him too and gave the signal. One tap on the chicken wire. Barely audible but clear. Enemy on the left. She moved quickly, quietly, crossed the room to the back window, and opened the sliding panel. The field was empty until two more figures stepped into the open, bold as wolves. One held a lantern, the other carried a rope. Delaney exhaled through her nose, steady, slow, and raised her rifle. She waited. Let them come closer. Closer. And then, fired. The man with the lantern went down, shouting, dropping light and glass in a shatter that lit the field for one brief second. The other shouted, ducked, fired back, missed. Elias fired next. The second man dropped. One clean shot through the shoulder. But that was just the start. Gunfire erupted from the tree line. Shouts echoed off the barn. Splinters flew from porch beams. Bullets chewed the siding like termites with iron teeth. Delaney dropped flat behind the overturned table, heart pounding, but breath steady. She reloaded, popped up, and fired again. This time at the muzzle flash near the goat pen. Silence followed. She ducked. Outside, Elias was moving low, weaving between the hay bales and barrels. He rolled behind the trough, lifted his shotgun, and waited. Then he saw them. 3 more riders, coming hard from the west. They weren't subtle anymore. Delaney spotted them too. She ran to the west window and shouted, "Riders!" Elias didn't hesitate. He fired once, took one off his horse. The rider crashed hard, the others veering wide. Delaney got the second one, shot straight through the thigh. The last kept coming. He drew his pistol and aimed at the front door. Delaney stepped into the open, pulled the trigger. Click. Empty. The rider grinned, raised his gun. Then Elias appeared from the side and tackled him off the horse. The 2 men crashed into the mud, fists flying, boots kicking. Delaney scrambled to reload. By the time she looked up, Elias had the upper hand, driving the butt of his shotgun into the man's ribs, knocking the breath clean out of him. Then silence again. No more gunfire. No more shouting. Just wind. Elias rose, chest heaving, eyes sweeping the field. "They're falling back," he said. Delaney didn't lower her rifle. "You sure?" A pause, then a whistle. Faint, sharp, deliberate. Elias cursed under his breath. "It's a call." Delaney understood. Reinforcements. This wasn't the full crew. Not yet. And sure enough, moments later, another dust cloud rose from the ridge. 4 more riders. One of them waved something. White cloth. Delaney narrowed her eyes. "Parley," Elias muttered. "They want to talk." She didn't move. "You think it's real?" "Number up, but it might buy us time." They met in the center of the field, just outside the barn. Delaney kept her rifle across her chest. Elias stood beside her, bruised, blood at the corner of his mouth. The man who dismounted was older. Clean coat, scar above his eye, spoke like a lawyer, smiled like a snake. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "You already made it hard," Delaney replied. "We just want the child." "She's not yours." "She's not yours either." Delaney's jaw tightened. "She is now," the man sighed. "You think you can win this?" Elias stepped forward. "We don't need to win. We just need to outlast you. The man looked him over. You're bleeding. And still standing. Give us the baby and we'll walk away. No charges, no blood, no soul either, Delaney said flatly. The man's smile dropped. You have until nightfall, he said. Then we come back, all of us. He mounted and rode off without another word. They reinforced the cellar, lit lanterns and set traps, poured lamp oil at the tree line. Elias blocked the barn doors. Delaney wired the fence posts. Night came fast, and with it, the final wave. 15 men, some on horseback, some with fire, all with death in their eyes. Delaney crouched at the front porch, rifle loaded, lips tight. Elias took position on the barn roof, shotgun and pistol ready. They didn't speak. They didn't pray. They had already done both. The first torch hit the barn wall, but the wood didn't catch. Delaney had soaked it in water hours before. The second torch fizzled in mud. The third landed too close to the lamp oil trap. And that was a mistake. Delaney fired one shot, sparked the flame. The fire burst upward in a wall of orange and smoke. Men screamed, horses reared. Chaos split the night. Elias fired, one down. Delaney shot, another. A rider charged the porch, got as far as the first step before Delaney's boot met his jaw and sent him flying back. The night became thunder and smoke and the sound of choice crashing down around them. But they never broke. Not once. When the last gunshot echoed, only 2 men were left standing. Delaney Quinn, Elias Roan, and inside the root cellar, cradled in blankets and hope. Maisie slept through it all. The sun rose slow and silent over a field of smoke and stillness. Ash drifted like snow across the yard. The barn stood, scorched but unburnt. The porch was blackened in places. Bullet holes marred the posts. Blood soaked into the frozen ground. But the house still stood, and so did they. Delaney Quinn sat on the porch steps, rifle across her lap, coat torn at the elbow, dirt caked in her braid. Her knuckles were raw. Her breath came shallow but steady. Every muscle ached. Her ears still rang from the gunfire. Inside, Elias was quiet. He moved softly through the house, checking the windows, gathering what was left of their supplies. He didn't say much, just worked, like a man who needed motion to keep from unraveling. Down below, in the root cellar, Maisie had begun to stir. Her soft cries carried up through the floorboards like life itself trying to reclaim the air. Delaney pushed herself to her feet and made her way down. She opened the door slowly. Maisie blinked up at her with wide, unbroken eyes. No fear, no confusion. Delaney lifted the baby, wrapped her in fresh cloth, and held her to her chest. You slept through hell, little one, she whispered, but it's over now. When she stepped back into the daylight, Elias was waiting. He looked at her, looked at the child, then dropped his eyes to the rifle still in her hand. It's done, he said. Delaney nodded. For now. They stood in silence for a long while, the weight of what they'd survived sitting heavy between them. Then Elias cleared his throat. I should go, he said. It's not safe. Not if more come. Delaney stared at him. Go where? I don't know, south, west. Doesn't matter. She took a step forward, still holding the child. You think running again makes her safer? Elias opened his mouth, closed it. His shoulders sagged. I don't know how to stop running. Delaney looked down at Maisie, then back at him. Then learn, right here. He looked at her like a man being offered a second chance he didn't believe he deserved. I got nothing to give you, he said. You already did, she replied. You gave me something to fight for. He dropped his eyes. I buried too many things on the road behind me. Cora, our past, even my own name. Delaney took a breath. Then let's start with a new one. Elias looked up, confused. Delaney reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper. The land deed, signed, notarized, 2 names on it, Quinn, Roan. You're not a guest anymore, she said. This is your home now, if you want it. He didn't speak, just stared at the paper like it might burn in his hands. You gave that baby a future, she said. Now it's time to give yourself one. He took the deed, folded it slowly, tucked it into his breast pocket with hands that shook. All right, he said softly. Then I stay. That night the valley was quiet. Not dead, not fearful, just quiet. peaceful. They buried the bodies beyond the ridge, marked only with stones. No names, no markers. Just a reminder that men had come to take something that was never theirs, and failed. Maisie laughed for the first time 3 days later, a full, round, innocent laugh that filled the rafters with something Delaney hadn't heard in years. Joy, real joy. Elias was outside chopping wood. She stepped onto the porch holding the baby, the sound still echoing through the house. He looked up, eyes squinting against the sun. She laughed, Delaney said, smiling. Elias leaned the axe against the log and walked over, brushing the baby's cheek with the back of his fingers. I'd forgotten what that sounded like. She hasn't, Delaney said. She'll grow up knowing it. They stood there together for a long time. No more words needed. In the days that followed, the town began to hear whispers. That Delaney Quinn's land was no longer just hers. That a man had fought to protect it and lived. That something had changed out there. Not just survival. Hope. When spring came, green pushed up through the blackened ground. The chickens returned to the yard. The goats fattened. The well held true. The garden came back stronger than ever. Neighbors started showing up again. Old Lester helped repair the barn wall. Widow Esther brought seed and jars of jam. No one asked what happened. They just looked at Elias with quiet respect, and at Delaney was something close to admiration. One morning the sheriff rode up. Not Merrick. He'd left town not long after the gunman failed. Word was the Langfords had pulled their gold back east. The new sheriff tipped his hat. Trouble done? He asked. Delaney nodded. For now. The sheriff looked at Elias, then at the child. She yours? Elias answered without hesitation. Ours. The sheriff smiled. Then you'll want to file proper papers. We will. He rode off, leaving dust and sunlight in his wake. That evening, Elias carved something into the beam above the door. 3 letters, MQR, Maisie Quinn Roan. Delaney smiled when she saw it. Looks permanent, she said. Elias looked over. That's the idea. The sun dipped low, painting the land gold. Maisie crawled across the porch, chasing shadows and giggling at her own hands. Delaney sat beside Elias, her hand slipping into his without needing to ask. You still think you've got nothing to offer? She asked. He shook his head. Turns out I just didn't know what was worth saving. She leaned against him, watching the baby crawl toward the doorway, sunlight kissing the curls at the back of her head. And now? I do, he said. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. The land had spoken for them. It stood whole, unburned, unbroken, and for the first time in a long, long while, so did they. When running would be easier. Delaney didn't owe Elias anything. Elias had nothing left to give. And yet, through one unthinkable night and 100 unspoken moments, they built something no enemy could tear down. A home. If this story stirred something in you, we want to hear it. What would you risk everything to protect? A child? A memory? A piece of land you call your own? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Every story you tell adds a stone to the fire pit we gather around, and we'll be here next time with another tale from a West that never truly sleeps.